Hey there. Tonight's video is something a little different. Normally I keep things shorter, but this time I wanted to try a longer story format. The kind of video you can fall asleep to, listen to on a long drive, or just relax with it playing in the background. And what better story to tell than the entire history of Shaka Zulu? From his early struggles to the empire he built, his victories, betrayals, and the legacy he left behind, we're going deep. So sit back, get comfortable, and let me take you on this journey. And if you enjoy this longer style of content, please let me know in the comments so I can make more videos like this. Okay, imagine this. The year is the early 1820s. You're standing on a hill in what is now KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. Below you, the ground shakes with the thunder of marching feet. Thousands of warriors move in perfect rhythm, their oval shields catching the light of the sun, short stabbing spears held low. At their head is a tall, commanding figure. His presence alone is enough to silence the noise of the crowd. His name is Shaka. For friend and foe alike, that single word is enough to inspire awe, fear, and a recognition that nothing in this land will ever be the same again. But to understand how Shaka came to this point, how the son of a disgraced princess and a minor chieftain could rise to command tens of thousands, we need to step back. Way back, to a world where the Zulu were not yet a great kingdom, but a small clan among many. To a time when power was fragmented, when cattle meant wealth, and when politics was played out through alliances, marriages, and raids. The land we're talking about is the southeastern coast of Africa, rolling hills and river valleys stretching inland from the Indian Ocean. The people here lived in scattered homesteads, bound together by kinship and loyalty to their chiefs. Among the largest of these groups were the Mtetwa and the Ndwandwe. Between them were dozens of smaller clans, the Kwabe, the Buthelezi, the Ndwandwe, and yes, the Zulu. The Zulu at this point were little more than one clan among many. They held no great power, no famous name. Their cattle herds were modest, their political weight light. If you had looked at the map of the region around 1780, you wouldn't have bet on the Zulu to rise above anyone else. So what changed? The answer, as you'll see, lies not just in the genius of one man, but in the conditions of his time. Warfare was already intensifying in the region. Competition for grazing land and water was fierce. Chiefs relied on cattle not just for food, but for bride wealth. Without it, men could not marry, and without marriage, there were no alliances. Raiding for cattle was already a way of life, but it was still done in a loose, almost casual fashion. Young men would be organized into age grades, given some basic weapons, and then sent out in scattered formations. Battles looked more like skirmishes, often ending with both sides retreating with a few stolen cows. It was disruptive, but it was not yet transformational. Enter Nandi, a woman whose resilience shaped the destiny of her son. Nandi was from the Langeni clan, and her relationship with Senzangakona, a Zulu chief, was marked by scandal. She bore Shaka out of wedlock, which in that society carried deep stigma. The young boy grew up marked as different, ridiculed by peers, and often marginalized. And yet, that very hardship forged in him a resilience and a hunger to prove himself. Shaka was an outsider in his own clan, and it was precisely this outsider's perspective that gave him the ruthless determination to break the rules of the old order. Now, why does this story matter beyond southern Africa? For one, Shaka's rise coincided with one of the most dramatic periods of upheaval in African history, often called the Simfakane or Difakane. The very meaning of that word, Whether it was truly a crushing caused by Shaka or a broader wave of social and economic forces is still hotly debated. Some historians see Shaka as the central driver of the chaos, while others argue he was one of many leaders responding to pressures like drought, trade shifts, and political rivalries. What's undeniable is that his leadership created a ripple effect across southern Africa. Whole communities were displaced, new states were born, and European observers at the coast began to write down the first outsider accounts of the Zulu. This is not just the story of one man, then. It's the story of a region reshaped by his decisions, his wars, and his vision. It's also a story about myth, because much of what we know about Shaka comes filtered through colonial accounts, hearsay, and political agendas. Some describe him as a bloodthirsty tyrant, others as a brilliant nation-builder. The truth lies somewhere in between, and as we go through this history, I'll make sure to tell you when we're on solid ground and when we're standing in the fog of rumor. Think of this as a journey. In the chapters ahead, we'll walk through Shaka's early life, his time under the mentorship of Dingiswayo of the Mtetwa, his revolutionary military reforms, his wars with Zwide of the Ndwandwe, the building of the Zulu state, his encounters with Europeans at Port Natal, the controversies of his later rule, and finally, his assassination and enduring legacy. It's a 2-hour story, but one that deserves the time. Because in telling it, we're not just recalling battles and leaders, we're exploring how identity, memory, and power collide to shape history. Before we dive into Shaka's personal story, let's linger just a little longer on the world he was born into. Picture a society where cattle were currency. Every kraal, those circular homesteads with cattle at the center, was both a family unit and a political hub. The more cattle you had, the more influence you commanded. Chiefs distributed cattle to bind followers to them, and young men sought to earn cattle through service and raiding. Women's labor sustained the homesteads, from tending fields to processing milk, but their marriages also tied families together in webs of obligation. This was a world balanced delicately on tradition, kinship, and resource competition. But beneath that balance was instability. The late 18th century saw droughts that put pressure on grazing land. Trade routes toward the coast were shifting as Europeans and Africans exchanged ivory, hides, and later slaves. Groups like the Ndwandwe and Mtetwa were expanding aggressively, swallowing smaller clans. In this world, being small and disorganized was a death sentence. The Zulu, still minor players, survived by attaching themselves to stronger allies. And it was in this crucible of pressure, fear, and opportunity that Shaka grew up. And so, we have our stage, a fragmented land of clans and cattle. Two rising powers, the Mtetwa and the Ndwandwe, circling each other like predators. A boy named Shaka, born into shame but marked by destiny. And a moment in history when everything was about to change. To see how this young boy, mocked and marginalized, transformed himself into the man who would bend this landscape to his will, we need to step into his early years, his exile, his trials, and the fire that forged him under the mentorship of Dingiswayo. Now that we have an idea of the world Shaka was born into, the next part gives us the boy himself. Because to understand the general who would command thousands, you have to start with the child who grew up carrying scars. Shaka was born around 1787, the son of Senzanga Kona, a Zulu chief, and Nandi, a woman from the Langani clan. Their union was not formally sanctioned at first, and this would haunt Nandi and her son for years. In a society where legitimacy and marriage alliances were everything, being branded the child of shame left Shaka and his mother vulnerable. Nandi, by all accounts, was fiercely protective and proud. When other children mocked her son, she confronted their families, demanding respect. She instilled in him a defiance that would never leave him. But the ridicule cut deep. From an early age, Shaka learned two things: the cruelty of others and the necessity of strength. Life in a homestead revolved around chores: herding cattle, guarding fields, serving elders. Shaka did them all, but he never forgot the insults. Stories describe him as tall and lean even in his youth, with an intensity that set him apart. He had little patience for weakness, even in play. Later, as king, this intensity would become ruthlessness. Eventually, tensions within the clan reached breaking point. Whether pushed by rivals or political necessity, Nandi and Shaka were forced to leave the Zulu. They sought refuge first with the Langeni, Nandi's people. But even there, the stigma followed. Shaka was treated as an outsider, made to herd cattle alone, sometimes without food. For a boy, this could have been crushing. Instead, it hardened him. He developed endurance, long treks without sandals, living on meager scraps, surviving hostility. His body became tough, his spirit sharper. By his teens, Shaka entered the Ntanga, the youth regiment system. This was where boys were grouped into age sets for training and service. They learned discipline, obedience, and the basics of fighting. For Shaka, already burning with resentment, it was fuel on the fire. He threw himself into training with single-minded devotion, honing skills that would later shock his enemies. But fate would soon twist again. The political climate around 1802 saw increasing clashes between clans. The Mtetwa, under the leadership of Dingiswayo, were rising. Dingiswayo himself was unusual. Where other chiefs relied on tradition, he embraced innovation, even drawing inspiration from outside groups. Shaka's path crossed with his when he entered Mtetwa service, most likely as a refugee warrior seeking stability and recognition. This was the turning point. Under Dingiswayo, Shaka found something he had never had before: a mentor who saw potential in him. Dingiswayo valued intelligence and daring, and Shaka had both. He rose quickly through the ranks, first as an ordinary warrior, then as a commander of small units. Here, he began experimenting with tactics, tight formations, more aggressive spear use, and the importance of unity in battle. It's important to note, the famous Ikalwa, the short stabbing spear, is often credited to Shaka. But at this stage, he wasn't inventing weapons yet. He was learning how to fight with what he had, and how to push existing methods to their limit. Dingiswayo gave him room to test ideas. This was crucial. Without that space, Shaka might have remained a bitter exile, remembered by no one. One of the most striking things about Dingiswayo was his openness to diplomacy. Unlike many chiefs who sought only conquest, Dingiswayo built alliances, weaving networks of loyalty. He sent envoys, arranged marriages, and integrated groups rather than destroying them outright. Shaka absorbed this lesson. Later, when he had power, he would blend it with his own harsher methods, using both terror and diplomacy depending on what the situation demanded. But Dingiswayo was not just a political strategist. He was also a man who believed in merit over birthright. For someone like Shaka, whose birth had been a mark of shame, this was liberating. Dingiswayo didn't care that Shaka had been mocked as a child. He cared that Shaka delivered results on the battlefield. And Shaka delivered again and again, gaining a reputation as a fearless, even ruthless commander. It was during this period that Shaka began to understand the psychology of war. He noticed how fear could spread faster than blades. how discipline could turn a small force into a devastating one. He also began to cultivate his presence, walking tall, speaking sparingly, using silence as a weapon. People started to follow him not just because he ordered them to, but because he carried an aura of inevitability. But as Shaka's star rose, his father Senzangakona's health declined back among the Zulu. By the time Senzangakona died around 1816, a succession struggle broke out. Normally, Shaka would have had little claim. His status was too tainted. But here, fate and mentorship intervened. Dingiswayo supported Shaka's bid for leadership of the Zulu. Backed by Mtetwa power, Shaka suddenly had legitimacy. This was the crack in the door he needed. Shaka stepped through it, and the world would never be the same. Yet, let's pause here and consider. Without exile, without years of being hardened by hunger and mockery, without Dingiswayo's mentorship, would Shaka have become Shaka? It's tempting to imagine him always destined for greatness, but history is rarely that neat. His early suffering gave him steel. Dingiswayo gave him tools. The combination created the man who would transform southern Africa. By the end of this chapter of his life, Shaka had gone from outcast child to rising commander. He had learned endurance, discipline, and political craft. He had tasted both humiliation and respect, and most importantly, he had secured the backing of a powerful patron who believed in him. The stage was set for the next act, his rise to power as Zulu chief, and the first sweeping reforms that would revolutionize warfare. When Senzangakona, the Zulu chief and Shaka's father, died around 1816, the clan faced a familiar crisis: succession. In a society where multiple wives and many sons were common, the question of who should rule was never simple. Rival mothers promoted their own sons, factions formed, and violence often followed. For Shaka, legitimacy was a problem. His birth had long been clouded by scandal, and rivals had every reason to dismiss him. But here, the years spent under Dingiswayo paid off. Dingiswayo, leader of the powerful Mtetwa, backed Shaka's claim. With Mtetwa warriors at his side, Shaka pushed aside rivals, chief among them his half-brother Sigujana, who briefly held power after Senzangakona's death. Accounts differ on the details, but most traditions agree that Shaka had Sigujana killed, clearing the path to leadership. It was a violent beginning, but one consistent with the times. Leadership was not inherited peacefully. It was seized, and Shaka seized it with both hands. At first glance, his new domain was modest. The Zulu were still a relatively small clan compared to giants like the Ndwandwe, but Shaka wasted no time in changing that. He began by reorganizing the existing homesteads. Instead of loose, clan-based loyalty, he imposed tighter discipline. Warriors who once answered only to local headmen were now drawn into a centralized regimental system. This was not yet the full military machine he would later build, but the outlines were clear. Shaka also moved quickly to consolidate power through fear and reward. Those who resisted were executed or absorbed by force. Those who showed loyalty were given cattle and positions of responsibility. His leadership style was harsh but effective. No one could doubt his determination. One of his first acts was to establish a new royal homestead, a symbol of authority and a base for his growing regiments. These homesteads, called Amakanda, were more than just dwellings. They were military barracks, training grounds, and administrative centers all at once. By centralizing young men in these homesteads, Shaka could keep them under his watchful eye, subject them to rigorous discipline, and deploy them rapidly. At the same time, Shaka began reshaping the role of age grades. Traditionally, young men served until they were allowed to marry, after which they returned to homestead life. Shaka delayed marriage for many, keeping his regiments large, loyal, and unmarried, bound to him rather than to families of their own. This was revolutionary and not always popular, but it gave him a permanent standing army in a society where armies had once been temporary gatherings. But leadership wasn't just about military power. Shaka also needed to project authority in ways people could see and feel. He did this through ceremony, charisma, and ruthlessness. His public appearances were carefully staged, tall, muscular, carrying himself with absolute confidence. He demanded silence when he spoke, and he had the ability to make even seasoned warriors tremble under his gaze. People began to say that Shaka could kill a man with just a look, a myth that, whether true or not, served his purposes well. Consolidation also meant diplomacy. Shaka knew he couldn't fight everyone at once. He used Dingiswayo's influence to maintain alliances with Mtetwa allies, while carefully watching for opportunities to expand his own influence. Smaller clans, facing pressure from larger rivals, often found it safer to align with Shaka than to oppose him. By offering protection and by making examples of those who resisted, he drew more and more groups into his orbit. Still, his rise was not without challenges. Within his own ranks, older men resented the changes he imposed. Chiefs who had once enjoyed near autonomy bristled under his authority. And always, beyond his borders, the Ndwandwe under Zwide loomed as a threat. For the moment, though, Shaka's position was secure enough. Dingiswayo's backing gave him breathing room, and his own charisma and ferocity kept rivals in check. What set Shaka apart in these early years was his relentless drive. Many chiefs were content to rule as their fathers had ruled, following custom and keeping the peace. Shaka was not. He believed that survival required transformation, that the old ways were too weak, too vulnerable. He had seen firsthand how ridicule and marginalization could destroy a person. He would never allow his people to suffer the same fate. It was during this period that he began experimenting more boldly with military reforms. Spears were sharpened, shields lengthened, and formations drilled with precision. Shaka pushed his men to run barefoot long distances, toughening their feet so they could cover ground faster than any rival army. He punished cowardice harshly, sometimes with death, but rewarded bravery with cattle and prestige. Slowly, the Zulu army became something new, a force disciplined beyond anything their neighbors had seen. The psychological impact was just as important as the practical one. Neighboring clans began to fear the Zulu name. Stories spread of Shaka's ruthlessness and his warriors' discipline. Fear, as Shaka understood, was a weapon sharper than any spear. And yet, for all his ferocity, Shaka also understood loyalty. He remembered the sting of betrayal and ridicule in his youth, and he never forgot those who stood by him. Men who proved themselves could rise high, regardless of birth. This meritocratic streak, inherited perhaps from Dingiswayo, made the Zulu system more flexible and attractive than others. Ambitious young men flocked to Shaka's service, knowing they could make their name under him. By the time Dingiswayo was killed in conflict with Zwide, a turning point we will explore in more detail in the next segment, Shaka was no longer just a protege. He was a leader in his own right, with a growing army and an iron grip on the Zulu. When Dingiswayo's death left a vacuum among the Mtetwa, Shaka filled it, inheriting not only allies but also the expectation that he would carry forward the struggle against Zwide. This was the true moment of consolidation. The Zulu were no longer just one small clan. Under Shaka, they were becoming a nucleus of power, absorbing others, intimidating rivals, and reshaping the region's politics. And Shaka himself was evolving, from a young man burning with resentment into a ruler who wielded fear, loyalty, and innovation with equal mastery. The world had taken notice. The boy mocked as the child of shame was now a chief whose name spread in whispers and in shouts, a man whose ambition knew no limits. But the challenges ahead were immense. The Ndwandwe were stronger, larger, and more experienced. To survive, Shaka would have to push his reforms further than ever before. To truly understand how Shaka transformed war itself, how he turned scattered raiding bands into a disciplined engine of conquest, we need to look closely at his reforms. The weapons, the training, the discipline, and the way he restructured society around the army. When people talk about Shaka Zulu, they often imagine the warrior king striding across the battlefield, spear in hand, commanding thousands. But the real revolution wasn't just Shaka himself. It was the system he built. He didn't just fight wars. He reinvented how wars were fought. Let's start with weapons. Traditionally, Nguni-speaking warriors carried long throwing spears, called assegai. Battles were usually a matter of hurling spears at one another from a distance, with each side retreating after a few exchanges. It was more about raiding cattle and proving bravery than wiping out an enemy. Casualties were limited, and warriors could live to fight another day. Shaka changed that. He introduced the short stabbing spear known as the ikalwa. Its name came from the sound it supposedly made when pulled from a body. The ikalwa forced close combat. Warriors could no longer just throw and run. They had to close in, shield to shield, and finish the job. To complement this, he issued larger, sturdier cowhide shields. These weren't just for defense. They were tools of offense, used to hook an enemy's shield aside and open him up for the killing thrust. But weapons were just the beginning. Shaka reorganized his men into disciplined regiments, or amabuto. These regiments weren't temporary bands of young men. They were permanent, professional units, tied directly to the king. Each regiment had its own barracks, its own identity, its own colors. Warriors lived together, trained together, and fought together for years at a time. Training was relentless. Shaka drilled his men to run barefoot over rough ground, toughening their feet until they could cover incredible distances without pause. He expected warriors to march 50 miles in a single day if needed, carrying only their shield, spear, and minimal rations. This mobility gave the Zulu army a terrifying advantage. They could appear where no one expected them, strike, and vanish before rivals could react. Discipline was absolute. Cowardice or disobedience could mean death. Shaka demanded total commitment. If a regiment broke formation or fled, he sometimes executed survivors as an example. But he also rewarded bravery and success with cattle, honor, and personal recognition. In a society where prestige was everything, this was a powerful motivator. Warriors feared his wrath, but they craved his approval. The way battles were fought also changed. Shaka introduced the famous bullhorn formation. Picture this. The chest, the main body of the army, locked the enemy in place. The horns, two flanking forces, swept around to encircle them, and behind the chest was the loins, a reserve kept fresh for the decisive blow. It was a strategy of total destruction. Enemies weren't just beaten, they were trapped, broken, and annihilated. This was psychological warfare as much as tactical. Once word spread that the Zulu didn't just raid but destroyed, fear spread faster than his armies. Logistics mattered too. Shaka set up supply runners to keep his forces fed and informed. Communication was streamlined. Orders could travel miles with remarkable speed. This allowed him to coordinate large-scale movements across difficult terrain, something no rival leader matched at the time. But Shaka's reforms went beyond the battlefield. They reached into society itself. By delaying marriage for his warriors, he kept them focused on military service for longer. This had profound consequences. On one hand, it created an army of young men with no ties except loyalty to the king. On the other, it disrupted social norms. Families complained that sons were being withheld, and marriage patterns across the region were distorted. Shaka was reshaping not just armies, but communities. Ceremony reinforced this new order. Warriors wore distinctive attire, plumes, ornaments, shield designs that marked their regiment and status. Public parades displayed discipline and power, impressing allies and intimidating rivals. The king himself inspected regiments, watching drills with a sharp eye. This was theater, but it was also politics. Every display reminded people that the Zulu state was no longer just a clan. It was a machine. Of course, this transformation came at a cost. Shaka's system was brutal. Warriors lived under constant pressure, with little room for weakness or individuality. Death was common, whether in battle or as punishment. Families were often deprived of their young men for years, creating resentment. And subject groups absorbed into the Zulu fold sometimes resisted, facing harsh treatment if they refused loyalty. Shaka's reign was not just admired, it was feared. Yet, from a purely military standpoint, the results were undeniable. In less than a decade, the Zulu went from a minor clan to a power feared across southern Africa. Rivals who once laughed at them now trembled. Chiefs who resisted were swept aside. Refugees fled in all directions, spreading stories of Zulu ferocity. It's worth pausing here to think about Shaka's vision. He wasn't just reacting to threats. He was building something bigger. In his mind, survival required not just strength, but transformation. He had seen how weakness led to humiliation in his youth. He would never allow that for his people. By turning the Zulu into a permanent military society, he believed he was securing their future. But history is never simple. These same reforms that made the Zulu strong also destabilized the wider region. As the Zulu expanded, they pushed other groups out, triggering waves of migration and conflict. Whole communities were uprooted, wandering in search of new lands. Some historians argue this domino effect is what created the period known as the Afrikaans, though as we'll see later, this term is contested. Whether or not Shaka caused it, his military machine was at the center of it. For the men in the regiments, life was harsh, but also full of pride. To serve under Shaka was to be part of something legendary. Songs celebrated victories, dances reenacted battles, and warriors returned to homesteads as heroes, if they survived. For every family mourning a lost son, there was another basking in reflected glory. This tension between pride and grief, loyalty and fear, was the paradox of Shaka's system. By the early 1820s, the Zulu army was unlike anything else in southern Africa. Rivals were forced to adapt, copying Shaka's methods or perishing. But copying wasn't enough. They lacked his discipline, his charisma, and his relentless drive. Slowly but surely, the balance of power shifted. The reforms of these years set the stage for the great conflicts to come. The Ndwandwe under Zwide, still powerful and ambitious, would not sit quietly while Shaka rose. A clash was inevitable, and when it came, it would test every innovation, every reform, and every ounce of discipline that Shaka had forged. The stage was set for war. Zwide of the Ndwandwe loomed to the north, commanding armies as large as Shaka's, perhaps larger. The clash between them would decide not just the fate of the Zulu, but the entire balance of power across the region. By the early 1820s, Shaka's Zulu were transformed from a small clan into a disciplined military power. But to the north loomed a giant, the Ndwandwe, led by the formidable chief Zwide. If Shaka was brilliant, Zwide was no less cunning. His armies were larger, his territory broader, and his ambition every bit as sharp. For years, the Ndwandwe had been expanding, swallowing smaller groups and intimidating rivals. With Dingiswayo's death at Zwide's hands, the stage was set for a showdown. For Shaka, this was personal. Dingiswayo had been more than a mentor. He was the man who gave Shaka his chance. Now, Shaka inherited not just his mantle, but also his unfinished war. To prove himself, he had to confront Zwide. The first clashes were brutal. Zwide commanded tens of thousands of warriors, well-armed and battle-tested. Shaka, though disciplined, was still consolidating his base. Early encounters saw heavy losses on both sides. But Shaka learned quickly. He refused to fight on Zwide's terms. Instead of meeting him head-on in open terrain, Shaka used mobility, ambushes, and disciplined retreats. He turned his warriors into a razor-sharp blade, striking at weak points, pulling back before being crushed, and harassing the Ndwandwe supply lines. The decisive confrontation came around 1819 to 1820. Accounts differ, but many traditions describe the Battle of Gokli Hill as the turning point. The Ndwandwe army, vastly larger, descended on Shaka's position. Outnumbered, Shaka relied on strategy. He used the hill's terrain to funnel Ndwandwe forces into narrow approaches, blunting their numerical advantage. Then he countered with the bullhorn formation, encircling and annihilating units piece by piece. Though both sides suffered losses, the Ndwandwe were shaken. They had faced a smaller army and still failed to crush it. But Zwide wasn't finished. He launched a massive campaign soon after, sending his armies deep into Zulu territory. Shaka's response showed the genius of his system. He refused to give battle immediately, instead stretching Zwide's supply lines thin, forcing the Ndwandwe to forage and grow desperate. When the time was right, Shaka struck. The Ndwandwe army, hungry and exhausted, broke. What followed was chaos. Shaka's regiments pursued relentlessly, scattering survivors and killing those who resisted. This was more than a victory. It was a transformation. The Ndwandwe, once the greatest power in the region, collapsed. Zwide himself fled, later killed in exile. His warriors, scattered and broken, became refugees. Many fled north, west, and east, carrying with them both trauma and military knowledge. Some formed new states in distant lands, the Gaza in Mozambique, the Ngoni in Zambia and Malawi, the Swazi in Eswatini. These dispersals would reshape southern Africa for decades. For Shaka, the victory was total. The Zulu were no longer a rising power. They were the power. Their rivals had been destroyed, their enemies scattered. Suddenly, the political map of southern Africa was redrawn, and at the center of it all was Shaka, the once mocked boy who had now humbled the mightiest of chiefs. But victory brought consequences. Refugees fleeing Zulu expansion destabilized neighboring regions. Groups clashed over grazing land, food, and cattle. New wars erupted as displaced peoples fought to carve out space. This wider upheaval is often called the Memphikon, the crushing in Zulu, or Difakane, the scattering in Sotho. Some historians frame Shaka as the primary cause, arguing that his ruthless campaigns set off a chain reaction. Others insist he was just one part of a larger story, pointing to drought, trade shifts, and pressures from the coast as equally important. Either way, there's no denying that the wars with the Ndwandwe lit a fuse. For Shaka himself, the aftermath was both opportunity and challenge. On the one hand, he now had unparalleled prestige. Chiefs from across the region acknowledged his dominance. His regiments, hardened by years of war, were fiercely loyal. The Zulu capital swelled with new subjects, captured cattle, and tribute. On the other hand, ruling such a rapidly expanding domain was no easy task. Shaka had to integrate diverse groups, some willing, many resentful. He used both carrot and stick. Loyal followers were rewarded with cattle and rank. Resistant groups were terrorized into submission. The army remained the glue, binding together people who had once been enemies. One striking feature of this period is how Shaka's reputation spread. Stories of his victories reached far beyond his borders. Traders at Port Natal heard tales of the warrior king whose regiments annihilated armies. Refugees carried both fear and admiration across southern Africa. The Zulu name was no longer local, it was continental. Still, the wars left scars. For the Ndwandwe survivors, the destruction of their state was catastrophic. Families were broken, homesteads burned, communities scattered. For neighboring chiefs, the lesson was clear. Resist Shaka and face annihilation. For ordinary people, it meant living in a world of constant fear, migration, and uncertainty. Shaka himself seemed energized by victory. He poured his efforts into consolidating the gains, reorganizing regiments, founding new royal homesteads, and expanding his administrative reach. He also became more ruthless. Success had proven that terror worked. Now he used it more deliberately. Looking back, the wars with the Ndwandwe were a crucible. They tested Shaka's reforms, proved their effectiveness, and cemented his authority. Without them, the Zulu might have remained a regional power, one among many. With them, they became a juggernaut, feared and respected across the subcontinent. And yet, as often happens in history, triumph planted the seeds of future challenges. Expansion brought new enemies, new resentments, and new pressures. Refugees destabilized distant regions in ways Shaka couldn't control. And within his growing kingdom, the balance between loyalty and fear grew ever more precarious. With Zwide defeated and the Ndwandwe scattered, Shaka now stood as master of his world. But conquest was only half the story. To hold his kingdom together, he needed more than victories. He needed administration, diplomacy, and a way to keep society running under the shadow of the spear. By the early 1820s, Shaka stood victorious. The Ndwandwe were shattered, rivals subdued, and the Zulu army feared across the land. But conquest is only half the story of leadership. Winning battles builds power, but holding power requires something else: governance. And here, too, Shaka left his mark. At the heart of his kingdom was cattle. To the Zulu, cattle were not just food. They were wealth, currency, and the lifeblood of society. Shaka understood this deeply. He centralized control of cattle herds, using them as both carrot and stick. Loyal followers were rewarded with cattle, giving them prestige and security. Defiant groups had their herds seized, reducing them to dependence. Tribute flowed into royal kraals, where vast herds symbolized not just wealth, but also authority. Royal homesteads, or amakanda, became the centers of this system. These were not simple households. Each was a hub of administration, housing warriors, storing supplies, and serving as local seats of power. At the center of each kraal stood the cattle enclosure, a constant reminder of what underpinned the entire kingdom. Around it, warriors lived in disciplined quarters, while royal retainers managed logistics, disputes, and tribute. From these homesteads, Shaka could project control across his expanding territory. Justice under Shaka was swift and often brutal. Petty crimes, like cattle theft or desertion, were punished harshly, sometimes by execution. He believed that fear maintained order, and he made examples of offenders. Yet justice also reinforced his legitimacy. By positioning himself as the ultimate arbiter, he ensured that disputes ended at his word. For ordinary people, this could be both terrifying and stabilizing. They knew that in Shaka's system, there was no appeal beyond the king. Integration of conquered groups was another challenge. Shaka could not simply exterminate every rival. He needed their labor, their warriors, and their loyalty. His solution was a mix of assimilation and control. Captured youths were folded into regiments, stripped of old loyalties, and bound into the Zulu system. Women were married into loyal families, tying clans together through kinship. Elders who resisted were eliminated, but those who cooperated could retain limited authority under Shaka's shadow. In this way, he built not just an army, but a multi-ethnic state. Ceremony and ritual reinforced this new order. Shaka staged grand gatherings where regiments paraded in precise formation, thousands of shields gleaming in the sun. Songs celebrated his victories, while dancers reenacted battles. These were not just displays of pride, they were political theater. Every performance reminded people of the king's power and the unity of his nation. For an outsider watching, it must have looked like the heartbeat of a single organism, every man moving to the will of one leader. Shaka was also a master of diplomacy. He knew when to terrorize and when to negotiate. Neighboring chiefs were offered alliances in exchange for tribute. Envoys were sent with gifts, messages, or threats, depending on what was required. To distant groups, Shaka projected both power and opportunity. Join the Zulu orbit and share in its prestige, or resist and risk annihilation. This combination of fear and diplomacy extended his influence far beyond what his armies alone could reach. Trade played a subtle but important role. At Port Natal, European traders were beginning to establish footholds, seeking ivory, hides, and other goods. Shaka engaged cautiously. He allowed limited trade, recognizing the value of firearms and metal goods, but he never became dependent. Unlike some chiefs who rushed to embrace European alliances, Shaka kept control firmly in his own hands. The Zulu would not be anyone's puppets. Administration required more than warriors and cattle. It required communication. Shaka used runners to carry messages swiftly across his kingdom, ensuring that orders reached distant homesteads and that news returned just as quickly. This network gave him real-time control in a way few leaders of the era could match. It also reinforced his presence. Even in far-off villages, the king's will arrived daily through the feet of his messengers. Yet, as with his military system, Shaka's governance came at a cost. Life under his rule was demanding. Tribute was heavy, service was long, and punishments were severe. People admired his strength, but also lived in fear of his wrath. Resentment simmered among conquered groups. and even among his own followers who chafed at endless service. For now, fear kept it in check. But fear is a brittle foundation. Still, the achievements of this period cannot be overstated. In just a few years, Shaka had transformed a fragmented cluster of clans into a centralized state. He had institutions, regiments, royal kraals, tribute systems, communication networks. He had ideology, loyalty to the king, pride in military discipline, belief in the destiny of the Zulu. And he had results. Enemies crushed, wealth amassed, prestige soaring. This is where we see the duality of Shaka most clearly. On one hand, he was a brutal autocrat, ruling through terror and blood. On the other, he was a visionary state builder, creating systems that would outlast him and shape the identity of a people for generations. Both sides are true, and both are essential to understanding his legacy. By the mid-1820s, the Zulu Kingdom was no longer fragile. It was resilient, organized, and feared. Shaka could turn his attention outward, not just to war, but to encounters with foreigners who were beginning to creep inland. Traders at Port Natal, adventurers, and missionaries all began to take note of the powerful king whose warriors dominated the region. Their writings would spread Shaka's fame beyond Africa, though often colored by bias and exaggeration. For the Zulu themselves, daily life was reshaped. Boys grew up knowing they would one day serve in the regiments. Women lived with both pride and hardship, supporting warriors and producing the next generation. Elders, once the unquestioned custodians of tradition, now deferred to the king's authority. The rhythm of life itself pulsed to the beat of the military drum. While Shaka mastered the art of ruling at home, new forces were arriving on his doorstep. Traders, hunters, and adventurers at Port Natal began to write down what they saw. For the first time, Shaka's kingdom was being observed by outsiders, foreign eyes that would shape how the world remembered him. By the mid-1820s, Shaka's name was already legendary across southern Africa. Refugees told of his armies, allies praised his power, and rivals cursed his ferocity. But now, his fame began to spread beyond Africa's frontiers. At Port Natal, today's Durban, European traders, hunters, and adventurers began to encounter the Zulu Kingdom. And with them came the first written accounts of Shaka, accounts that would shape how the world saw him for centuries. Port Natal was not yet a major colony. It was a ragged trading post, a thin thread linking the interior to the outside world. Europeans came seeking ivory, hides, and other goods. Africans came to barter cattle, meat, and labor. Into this marketplace, Shaka inserted himself carefully. He recognized the potential benefits of trade, but he never allowed himself to be dependent. Accounts suggest Shaka permitted limited contact, often through trusted intermediaries. Traders like Henry Francis Finn and Nathaniel Isaacs became known as white hunters, who spent time in his court. They described his regiments, his court ceremonies, even his personality. But here's the problem. Their accounts were not neutral. They wrote to impress audiences back in Europe, sometimes exaggerating, sometimes fabricating. To them, Shaka was both a curiosity and a ticket to fame. Take Isaacs, for example. His writings painted Shaka as both brilliant and barbaric, an exotic, savage king who fascinated European readers. He described ceremonies where thousands of warriors chanted in perfect unison and punishments where disobedient subjects were executed without hesitation. Some of this rings true, fitting with what we know of Shaka's system. But some stories veer into sensationalism crafted to shock. Shaka himself seems to have used these encounters to his advantage. He understood the power of image. By staging parades and allowing traders to witness his regiments, he projected strength not just to locals, but to distant lands. At the same time, he limited access. Foreigners saw what he wanted them to see. In this sense, Shaka was one of the first African leaders to manipulate the European gaze. But misunderstandings abounded. European visitors came with their own assumptions and prejudices. They interpreted Zulu discipline as cruelty, Zulu ceremony as savagery, and Zulu justice as barbarism. They missed the context, that in a world of constant warfare and fragile survival, harsh measures were not mere whim, but political necessity. Still, their writings had enormous influence. Back in Europe, newspapers and books eagerly published tales of the African Napoleon. Shaka was cast as a figure both monstrous and magnificent, a ruler whose genius was matched only by his brutality. This dual image, part admiration, part fear, would stick. Even today, much of Shaka's global reputation comes not from Zulu oral tradition, but from these outsiders' pens. Let's not forget the intermediaries, the interpreters, guides, and local allies who bridged the gap between Zulu and European. Their role was enormous. They chose what to translate, how to phrase it, and what details to emphasize. In their hands, Shaka's words could be softened, sharpened, or distorted entirely. The Shaka that Europeans knew was as much a creation of these interpreters as of the man himself. The encounters weren't just about image, they had practical stakes too. Firearms and trade goods trickled into the region. Shaka allowed some into his kingdom, but was cautious. He did not restructure his army around guns, unlike some other African rulers of the time. He recognized that muskets of the era were slow, inaccurate, and unreliable compared to the speed and discipline of his warriors. Better, he thought, to master close combat than to gamble on untested tools. It was a decision that kept the Zulu military uniquely African in style, even as others experimented with European weapons. Trade also brought new forms of wealth, beads, cloth, and trinkets that became status symbols. Shaka used these to reward loyal followers, weaving them into the economy of prestige alongside cattle. Once again, he controlled access tightly, ensuring that foreign goods flowed through him, not around him. But contact also brought new vulnerabilities. Europeans were chroniclers, and once stories left Africa, Shaka could no longer control them. Some portrayed him as a tyrant drenched in blood, others as a noble, almost regal figure. The truth lay somewhere between, but in Europe, myth was stronger than nuance. There's also a darker side. Traders sometimes sought to manipulate politics, offering support to rivals or encouraging instability to secure their own advantage. Shaka, ever cautious, kept them at arm's length. He welcomed goods, tolerated visitors, but never let foreigners dictate policy. For a time, his control was absolute. What's striking about this period is how modern it feels. Shaka understood branding, in a sense. He knew that power was not just about armies, but about perception. By shaping how outsiders saw him, he extended his reach far beyond his borders. This is why, even today, we still talk about him. His story was written into European imagination during his lifetime. Of course, the encounters at Port Natal were just the beginning. Later, Europeans would come not as traders, but as colonizers, missionaries, and soldiers. They would carry their distorted visions of Shaka with them, influencing how future generations judged both him and the Zulu. But in the 1820s, the balance was still in Shaka's favor. He was the one dictating terms, the one deciding how much access was given, the one shaping the narrative. For the Zulu themselves, foreigners were still a sideshow. The core of their world remained regiments, cattle, and loyalty to the king. But gradually, whispers of distant powers and strange goods crept in. The seeds of future entanglements were being planted. For all his control over image and power, Shaka was still a man, and even the strongest men are not invulnerable. When his mother Nandi died, grief pushed him into extremes. What followed tested the loyalty of his people and revealed the darker edges of his rule. By the late 1820s, Shaka was at the height of his power. His regiments dominated the land. His kingdom stretched wider than ever, and his name was whispered with awe from the coast to the mountains. But then came the blow that no spear could parry: the death of his mother, Nandi. Nandi had been more than just a mother to Shaka. She had been his protector in childhood, his fiercest defender when others mocked him, and perhaps the only person he ever truly trusted. Her pride in him had fueled his determination. Her resilience had shaped his own. When she died in 1827, Shaka was devastated. But grief alone does not explain what came next. The stories of Shaka's mourning are infamous. According to tradition, and especially to accounts from Port Natal visitors, he decreed that no crops be planted that year, condemning the kingdom to hunger. Women who became pregnant were executed, as no new life could be allowed, while his mother's death was mourned. Cows were slaughtered in such numbers that milk, a staple of the diet, became scarce. Ordinary people were forbidden to show joy. Some say even laughter was punished by death. Tens of thousands were reported executed for failing to display sufficient grief. If true, these acts were catastrophic, madness on a royal scale. But here's where caution is needed. Much of this comes from the pens of European chroniclers like Isaacs and Finn, who had every incentive to dramatize. Oral traditions confirm that Shaka's mourning was extreme, but they vary on the details. Some suggest the bans lasted only a few months, not an entire year. Others argue that the death toll was exaggerated, inflated by enemies who wanted to cast him as a monster. So what can we say with confidence? That Shaka's grief was real, and it manifested in severe kingdom-wide decrees. That the mourning rituals disrupted daily life and caused hardship, and that his response revealed a dangerous side of his rule, an increasing reliance on fear, paranoia, and displays of absolute power. This wasn't just about Nandi. By this stage, Shaka's authority was so great that no one dared contradict him. His word was law, no matter how harsh or impractical. Where earlier in his reign he had blended fear with reward, now fear seemed to dominate. His paranoia grew. He suspected rivals everywhere, among chiefs, regiments, even family. Some executions were not about grief at all, but about eliminating potential challengers. We have to imagine what this meant for ordinary people. Farmers forbidden to plant, women afraid to conceive, families punished for laughter. Whether the scale was as massive as chroniclers claimed or somewhat smaller, the impact was the same. Life under Shaka grew more suffocating. The reports also describe Shaka's increasing cruelty toward his own warriors. Exhausting drills, arbitrary punishments, and sudden executions bred resentment. The very discipline that had once inspired loyalty now became a source of fear. Warriors followed him, but some did so with dread rather than devotion. And yet, even in this period of darkness, Shaka's brilliance didn't vanish. He continued to expand his influence, sending expeditions farther afield, consolidating control over allies, and projecting authority through ceremony. His court at Bulawayo remained a place of spectacle, where regiments paraded in flawless unison. Foreign visitors still came, still marveled, still wrote about the African Napoleon. The machine he had built still functioned, but the cost of keeping it running grew heavier. This is the paradox of Shaka's later years. He was both at the peak of his external power and at the edge of internal collapse. His grief over Nandi seemed to accelerate a shift from visionary leader to paranoid autocrat. Where once he had carefully balanced fear and reward, now fear overshadowed everything. Historians debate how far this really went. Was Shaka truly descending into madness, or was this simply a harsher phase of a ruler always known for severity? Was he cracking under grief, or using Nandi's death as a pretext to tighten his grip? We can't be certain. What we can say is that his later rule alienated many who had once stood firmly behind him. Even his own family began to plot. His half-brothers, Ndwandwe and Mklangana, watched uneasily. They had seen how easily rivals were eliminated. They knew that Shaka's paranoia could one day turn on them. So they began to whisper, to scheme, to consider what life might be like without the towering shadow of their brother. For the kingdom as a whole, these years were a time of both awe and fear. People remembered Shaka's victories, his brilliance, his charisma. But they also remembered the mourning decrees, the executions, the suffocating grip of a king who seemed increasingly untouchable. It's worth stepping back here. Shaka's story is often told in extremes, either as the genius nation-builder or the bloodthirsty tyrant. The truth is both. His later years highlight the tyrant side more clearly, but we must never forget the context. His world was violent, precarious, and shaped by constant warfare. Harshness was not an aberration. It was the currency of power. Shaka simply wielded it more intensely than most. Still, the balance was tipping. Fear can sustain a kingdom, but it can also corrode it. As executions mounted and paranoia deepened, loyalty frayed. Chiefs who once admired him began to resent him. Warriors who once idolized him began to fear his wrath more than they feared the enemy. Even his closest kin began to calculate their chances of survival. By 1828, Shaka was both invincible and vulnerable. Invincible because his armies still dominated the region, his reputation still inspired awe, and his kingdom stretched wider than ever. Vulnerable because his rule had grown brittle, held together more by fear than loyalty. His harsh decrees after Nandi's death, his relentless demands, and his growing paranoia had alienated many who once admired him. Even his own family began to wonder if the kingdom could survive another season under his grip. Among those watching closely were his half-brothers, Ndwandwe and Mklangana. Both had ambition, both had tasted authority under Shaka, and both knew that their elder brother's suspicion could one day seal their fate. They were joined by Mbopa, an Nduna, advisor or headman, who had grown disillusioned with Shaka's rule. Together, they formed a conspiracy. The plan was dangerous. Shaka was still surrounded by regiments who feared and obeyed him. But the conspirators understood something vital. Fear does not equal loyalty. If Shaka fell, few would rush to defend him. Accounts of the assassination vary, as with so much in Shaka's life. Some say he was in his kraal at Dukuza, weakened by grief and exhaustion, surrounded only by a small guard. Others describe him walking outside when the conspirators struck. What most traditions agree on is that Mbopa played the active role, striking first, while Ndwandwe and Mklangana stood ready to finish the job. One version has Shaka being stabbed with spears while he tried to flee, crying out in disbelief as men he had raised turned against him. Another suggests he fought back, but overwhelmed by numbers, finally collapsed. His last words are lost to history, though later legends supplied them, casting him either as cursing his betrayers or warning that the Zulu would never be destroyed. The killing of Shaka was not just an act of murder. It was a coup. Within hours, Dingaan moved to secure power. He presented himself to the regiments as the rightful heir, promising stability after years of turmoil. The shift was smoother than one might expect. Warriors who had once sworn loyalty to Shaka now bent the knee to Dingaan. The fear Shaka had inspired did not translate into posthumous resistance. The kingdom moved on, as kingdoms often do. But Dingaan was not content to simply inherit. He knew that leaving loose ends could be fatal. He ordered the execution of Shaka's closest allies and supporters, purging the court of anyone who might challenge his rule. His brother Mklangana, co-conspirator though he was, soon fell victim as well, killed in the new power struggles. Dingaan intended to rule alone. What of Shaka's body? Here too accounts diverge. Some say it was buried hastily in an unmarked grave at Kwa Dukuza, covered with stones to hide it. Others say it was hidden so thoroughly that its exact resting place remains a mystery to this day. No monumental tomb, no shrine, just silence, as if the earth itself conspired to erase him. The immediate aftermath for the Zulu Kingdom was strikingly calm. There was no civil war, no mass rebellion. Life went on. Regiments drilled, cattle were herded, tribute was collected. In one sense, this shows the resilience of the system Shaka had built. The machinery of state was so strong that it survived even the death of its architect. But it also reveals something darker, that by the end, Shaka's personal rule was so resented that many were ready, even relieved, to see him go. Still, Shaka's ghost lingered. Dingaan could never fully escape his brother's shadow. Every decision he made was measured against the memory of Shaka. Where Shaka had ruled through fear, Dingaan often chose caution and diplomacy. But he also carried out brutal purges, perhaps to prove that he too could wield terror. The Zulu Kingdom lived on, but it was never quite the same. The assassination also marked the end of an era. With Shaka's death, the meteoric rise of the Zulu paused, expansion slowed, new threats emerged, not least from European settlers pressing into the interior. Under Dingaan, the Zulu would still be powerful, still feared, but never again would they dominate the region with the same unstoppable momentum as under Shaka. It's tempting to imagine what might have happened if Shaka had lived longer. Would he have expanded further, perhaps even reaching the Drakensberg or clashing earlier with colonial forces? Or would his paranoia have consumed the kingdom from within, sparking rebellion and collapse? We'll never know. What we do know is that his death by assassination tells us something vital about his rule. That even the most feared king cannot rule forever through fear alone. The image of Shaka falling under the spears of his brothers is haunting. A man who reshaped a region, who commanded tens of thousands, who terrified nations, undone not by foreign invaders or battlefield defeat, but by the hands of his own kin. It's a reminder that in politics, the greatest threats often come not from outside, but from within. With Shaka gone, the Zulu Kingdom endured, but the legend of Shaka grew. Historians, colonial officials, storytellers, and descendants would all shape his memory, debating whether he was a monster, a genius, or both. To finish our journey, we need to trace how Shaka's legacy lived on, through the Mfecane debates, colonial myth-making, and modern Zulu identity. When Shaka fell to the spears of his brothers in 1828, it could have been the end of the Zulu Kingdom. Many states have crumbled after the death of a charismatic founder. But Shaka had built more than an army. He had built institutions, regiments, royal kraals, tribute systems, and networks of power endured beyond him. The Zulu Kingdom lived on, though it would never again burn quite as brightly as under his hand. Ndwandwe, who seized the throne, inherited both the strength and the burdens of Shaka's creation. He ruled for over a decade, but his reign was marked by caution, intrigue, and eventually disaster. The kingdom clashed with Boer settlers, culminating in the famous Battle of Blood River in 1838, where Zulu forces suffered a crushing defeat. Later rulers, Mpande and Cetshwayo, kept the kingdom alive, but by the late 19th century, it faced the might of the British Empire. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 brought both Zulu triumph at Isandlwana and ultimate defeat at Ulundi. By then, the empire Shaka had built was broken, absorbed into colonial rule. But the shockwaves of his reign reached far beyond Zululand. The dispersal of refugees during and after his wars reshaped southern Africa. New states rose in distant lands, the Gaza in Mozambique, the Ngoni who spread as far as Zambia, Malawi, and Tanzania, the Swazi in Eswatini. Trade routes shifted, populations scattered, and political maps redrew themselves. To many, this upheaval is known as the Mfecane, the crushing in Zulu, or the Difakane, the scattering in Sotho. Here lies one of history's fiercest debates. Was Shaka the architect of the Mfecane, driving waves of destruction across the subcontinent? Or was he just one leader caught in wider forces? Drought, competition for ivory trade, pressures from the Cape Colony pushing displaced groups inward. Some historians of the 20th century blamed Shaka almost entirely, painting him as a bloodthirsty tyrant whose conquests destabilized half a continent. More recent scholarship has challenged this, pointing out that European colonial expansion and slave raiding also played major roles. The truth, as usual, lies in between. Shaka's wars certainly created refugees and reshaped the map. But the Mfecane was not his doing alone. It was the collision of many forces at once. Beyond the debate lies the question of memory. How was Shaka remembered, and by whom? For the Zulu people, oral traditions preserve both admiration and fear. He is remembered as the founder who turned a minor clan into a nation, the military genius whose regiments became legend, the king who gave the Zulu a name that endures. At the same time, his harshness, paranoia, and grief-stricken decrees are not forgotten. In Zulu memory, he is both great and terrible, a figure larger than life. Colonial writers, on the other hand, often exaggerated him into myth. European chroniclers at Port Natal described him as the African Napoleon, a ruler of extraordinary brilliance but monstrous cruelty. They wrote for European audiences hungry for tales of exotic savagery, and in doing so, they shaped Shaka's image for the world. To some, he became a symbol of African genius, proof that great leaders could emerge anywhere. To others, he was a cautionary tale of barbaric despotism. Either way, his story was never neutral. In the 20th century, Shaka's image took on new layers. Under apartheid in South Africa, his legacy was both appropriated and feared. Some white historians used him as proof of supposed African savagery, justifying domination. At the same time, Zulu nationalists embraced him as a symbol of pride, resistance, and unity. Plays, novels, and later television series like Shaka Zulu in the 1980s brought his story to mass audiences, though often in distorted, sensationalized ways. Today, Shaka remains a contested figure. To some, he is a hero, a nation-builder, strategist, and visionary. To others, he is a tyrant, responsible for untold suffering. But perhaps the most honest view is to hold both truths together. He was a man of his time, ruthless because his world demanded it, brilliant because he refused to accept its limits. He embodied both the promise and the peril of absolute power. What cannot be denied is his impact. Without Shaka, there would have been no Zulu Kingdom as we know it. Without Shaka, Southern Africa's 19th century history would look entirely different. And without Shaka, the very identity of the Zulu people might not exist in the form it does today. In the end, Shaka's story is not just about battles and conquests. It is about memory, myth, and the way we tell history. His life reminds us that leaders are never just what they were. They are what people say they were. Stories exaggerate, distort, and reinvent. And in Shaka's case, the stories have made him immortal. So what do we make of him? A genius? A tyrant? A visionary? A monster? Perhaps all at once. Shaka was a boy mocked as illegitimate who rose to command an empire. He was a reformer who turned raiding bands into a disciplined military machine. He was a son who loved his mother so fiercely that her death unbalanced him. He was a king who ruled through fear, and a man who died by betrayal. And above all, he was a force of history, one of those rare figures who bend the world around them, leaving marks that centuries cannot erase. More than 200 years after his birth, the name Shaka still echoes, not just in Zululand, not just in South Africa, but across the world. His story is a reminder that history is never simple, never clean, and never finished. It lives on as long as we tell it.